Hello there, ladies and gentlemen of the World Wide Web. My name is Edda320, and welcome to part one of my two-part series dissecting the origins, design, production, variants, and usage of the M3 Lee medium tank. Its entire life history documented right here in one foul swoop. You see, I've been thinking a lot about the M3, and I'm not entirely sure why. I guess it's probably got something to do with its relation to the Sherman, or maybe that one really good restoration series by a certain military museum down in Australia. I don't know. The M3 is a tank that I think most people genuinely don't understand. Everyone just sees it as the tank that came before the Sherman. And it was a stopgap vehicle, it was never actually meant to be that good, nobody really liked it all that much, and it came and went, whatever, moving on. Everyone loves the Sherman, including me. But I think people fail to see the idea, the M3 as an abstraction. When I originally had the idea for this script, I legitimately just wanted it to be a very simple, hey, let's take a look at the origins of the M3. Everyone says this tank was bad, but maybe it wasn't actually that bad. Maybe it did exactly what it needed to do, and cover some things that people may have actually somewhat liked about it, and move on. But as I learned more and more about this tank, my idea of American tank history was fundamentally changed. The story behind this tank is incredible and so much larger than any one or even two videos can actually do justice for, but I'm going to try my damnedest here. It got to a point where every new thing just got me interested, and I kept reading more and adding more and more to my script. To the point where one night I was scrolling through the whole thing, all 20,000 plus words, and realized that I had just made a video where I summed up the entire existence of the M3 from start to finish. It was so bloated, but I loved it. I didn't want to get rid of any of it. All of it was important to me. So finally I figured, why not? Why don't I just make a video or two summarizing the entire existence of the M3 from start to finish? Who built it and why, when it was built, who used it, did they like it, what did they not like about it, how did it fare in combat, how many different versions were made, how it changed over its history, and just fundamentally, what was the M3 and what can we learn from it? If you're a patron, you'll get the full, probably 4-hour-long feature-length film that I originally planned for this to be, before deciding that it needed to be split up into multiple parts just for digestibility. You'll also get some behind-the-scenes and special bonuses as a thank you for your support. If you're not a patron already, you should seriously consider it, as it's easily the best way to support me and keep me doing awesome stuff like this. If not though, I understand, and leaving a like and subscribing would be just fine. So thank you, thank you. Anyways, in the vein of my original plans for this script, I wanted to talk about the origins of the M3, to really dive into why it was the way that it was. I talked similarly about the T-34 in a previous video, where I described it as the pursuit of the perfect tank, but seeing that we live in the real world, one that ultimately failed. But the M3 is almost the exact opposite.
Contrary to popular belief, the United States was actually in a pretty sorry state in the years leading up to World War II, especially when it came to tanks. We had shoddy doctrine, mediocre designs, not that much experience, and mostly, we had no industry for mass tank production. But then, the Germans start marching, the French go running, and the British come knocking. And out comes the M3. A tank born out of necessity, and it's through this necessity that the United States takes a very serious look at its tank forces, and the industry behind them. Where before we didn't really have a tank, we made one. And where before we didn't have tank factories, we made one. While the M3 would have its fair share of quirks, and was ultimately always intended to be superseded by the M4, it nevertheless built its own legacy. Quite literally. Without it, I do not believe the United States would have been able to do what it did in World War II. It resembles an incredibly important stepping stone in the path to becoming the arsenal of democracy. They say we stand on the shoulders of giants. And for sure, the M3 was one tall bastard.
It is indeed somewhat of a third wheel in the Allied arsenal, but is, in my opinion, the unsung hero of World War II. In 1936, the U.S. Army Ordnance Committee advocates for the creation of a new medium tank based on infantry requirements. The idea was essentially to just upscale the recently adopted M2 light tank. Development began at Rock Island Arsenal. The tank would use the Continental R670 7-cylinder radial engine, as used on the M2 light, and would weigh about 15 tons, to meet bridge capacity of the Royal United States at the time. There was an argument as to whether the tank was going to utilize a turret or sponson-mounted guns, but this being interwar America, they decided to just do both. The original vehicle, named T5 Phase 1, began testing in November of 1937, although the planned high-velocity 37mm gun wasn't ready in time for the first tanks to be completed, and so instead twin M2A1 guns were used. And this tank actually survives in the Armor and Cavalry Collection down in Fort Moore, Georgia, to this day. But after testing of T5 Phase 1, the Army noticed that they wanted to make some changes, namely an increase in armor and more speed. Both of these changes would be addressed in the T5 Phase 3 vehicle. It's really kind of weird. T5 Phase 2 did exist, there were drawings of it, but it never left the drawing board. They never actually made a T5 Phase 2, so they go from the Phase 1 straight to the Phase 3. The weight was raised to 20 tons, and the engine was swapped out for the Wright R975 9-cylinder gas radial engine. Sound familiar?
Also, real quick, in the editing room edit here, want to point out that one of the other changes they made to the T5 Phase 3 was they moved the driver's position slightly off to the left. So the driver was no longer centered. There was this big gap on the right sponson. It's actually really difficult to notice in photos of the T5 Phase 3 unless you have one that's like properly head on. This change was controversial, and they are going to go back on it when they standardize on the M2. However, the fact that they did this is an important detail because it's going to come back later.
Sadly, these original versions of the legendary R975 engines still had a lot of kinks of their own to work out, and the power increase it provided over the T5 Phase 1 was barely measurable. I think it was like 2 miles an hour. The Army suddenly got interested in diesel engines and swapped out the R975 for a 9-cylinder radial diesel engine, and the T5 Phase 3 was renamed to the T5E1. As far as I know, the T5 is the only American tank ever to use this Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3 nomenclature. After this, they obviously go back to using the E1, E2, E3. Actually, even before the T5, they were doing E1, E2, E3. I really don't know what they were thinking with the T5. They were just doing some whack shit. But all of this work on the Phase 3 was side quest stuff. It's 1938, and the Army needed their new medium tank. So it was just decided to standardize on the T5 Phase 1 and build those with the high-velocity 37mm gun and the still kinky but more future-proof R975 engine. And thus, in September of 1938, the M2 medium was born. Now, to be totally honest, there's not that much fanfare around the M2. During its time in service, a few bugs were found and things were changed. The turret walls were made vertical, and the recoil mechanism for the 37 was improved to give the turret more space. The armor was increased to 1 1/4 inches everywhere, with the track width increased by 1 inch to accommodate for the new weight, and the newer, good version of the R975 was developed. All of these changes were going to be included on the now so-called M2A1 tank, slated to be introduced in 1940. But then, war were declared.
Unless, of course, war were declared.
What's that?
War were declared.
The invasion of France shocked the world, and the success of German panzer divisions made ripples across the US military. To be honest with you, the sheer amount of changes the United States military goes through in such a short period of time as a reaction to the fall of Paris is legitimately worthy of its own video. The establishment of tank destroyer branch, the mass production of the M2 Browning machine gun for anti-aircraft work, and indeed the increased air defense measures employed across the Army in fear of Stukas, doctrinal rewrites, restructuring of jobs, reallocation of military spending, and of course, what we really care about, the increased need for tanks. By the time 1940 rolls around, the US Army consisted of 8 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division, and other brigades of various types. Now at this time, the US Army did not have a dedicated tank force. Remember that tanks belonged to the infantry, as per the National Defense Act of 1920. So if you were going to find tanks anywhere in the US Army, it was going to be in those 8 infantry divisions, with the one exception of that cavalry division and the cavalry brigades. But, as per the National Defense Act of 1920, the cavalry were not technically allowed to have tanks, but instead had to use combat cars. Now in practice, since no real line was drawn between a combat car and a tank, besides weight, the cavalry end up with tanks anyways, but they just have to call them combat cars. Ignoring the early periods when they were legitimately trying to find some kind of weird hybrid between a tank and an armored car, and sometimes even a half-track, but that's a story for another video. Seeing what had happened in France, it was decided that more focus was going to be needed on American tank forces, both expansion of the current and development of the new. For both of these tasks, the US was going to need to revamp its tank industry, or what little of one they had. You see, the US Army had at the time what I'll just dub the arsenal system, in which a government-owned workshop of medium scale would do all of the initial design and development of military equipment, as well as small-scale production. All of you firearms enthusiasts might be familiar with the original Springfield Armory. That was the arsenal for small arms, and where many of America's most iconic weapons like the M1 Garand and the M14 were first developed.
Now, the role of Springfield in this case was intended to be that of, it would be a repository of experts and expertise where they could build a production line set of tooling for a firearm like the M1 Garand and figure out all the little quirks and get a complete technical data package, complete specs for all the tooling and jigs and dies and fixtures and gauges that you would need to make the M1 or any other firearm on an industrialized basis. And then they could, if we didn't need a lot of the guns, they could make a few and then kind of just put all the tooling and all this data in storage until such time as, oh no, we're at war, we need 1 million rifles. Now they have this data package that they can give to other commercial companies, private companies, who have the industrial capacity to manufacture the guns, and those companies won't have to figure this all out from scratch. This is frankly a really good idea. This is the sort of thing that a nationally funded armory ought to be doing.
Now imagine that, but for tanks. In our case, the arsenal in question is Rock Island Arsenal, where initial small-scale development of tanks, like the M2 and the M2A1, are being done. All of this in conjunction with Aberdeen Proving Ground, the US's main testing ground for tanks. Believe it or not, the US had made plans for rapid wartime industrialization all the way back in the early 1930s. Now, a repeating subtopic of this video that I'm sure you'll notice if you really pay attention is how much I'm going to harp on just how amazing it was that the United States was able to make so much military and industrial progress in such a short period of time. The buildup of the US Army and its armaments in the 1930s is quite possibly my favorite historical subject at the moment, and was a huge factor when deciding to make this video. If you'd like to learn even more about it, I highly recommend this video by The Chieftain. To be honest, I totally forgot this video even existed until I was doing the script for this video. Now I have to shoehorn it into this video somehow, so here is a quick clip describing what measures the US had undertaken in the 1930s that would set us up for what happens in the 1940s.
There are people that will go on at length about Knudsen and Kaiser and how great they were. They were great, don't get me wrong, but the foundations for what they were able to build on were actually built by the US Army in the 1930s. More than 2 years before FDR calls Knudsen to the White House, Ordnance Branch had split up the nation into ordnance districts. Each district was responsible for making the catalogue of industry. One of the things they did, for example, was they had all open houses. Rent out a convention center or a hall or whatever they had back in the 1930s, and they would put on display things that the Army might need made. Could be anything from helmets to fuel pumps to backpacks to headlights. Anybody that made things in private industry could come up, look at everything that the Army might want built and say, I can make that, I can make one of those, I can't make one of those. This is all catalogued by Ordnance Department. Generally speaking, the Army made its contracts with the big corporations like GM, and they did a lot of subcontracting out to other manufacturers, the cottage industries. But the catalogue was there that these major companies could use them if they wanted to.
So, to straighten this all out, a tank begins its life at Rock Island Arsenal. Here is where the engineers are given the task of designing a new armored vehicle, and the first prototypes are built. Kinks are worked out at Aberdeen Proving Grounds, and if the tank is liked, a small-scale production line is set up in the workshop at Rock Island. Here is where they will produce the pilot batch and outline exactly what is needed in man, material, and time costs to make these tanks. This data is then saved for if/when they need to issue contracts for producing these tanks to other manufacturers. Until that time, if the Army wants a few hundred more of these tanks, they'll be built through the arsenal. Once it is declared that outside manufacturers need to be used, Rock Island Arsenal has already done all the hard work. These data packages are then given to the contractor, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, etc., etc. Should the initial contractor have issues producing a certain component needed for the tank, Army Ordnance has a list ready to go of local manufacturers that can be used for subcontracting of those components. This is fucking genius, and is the essential building block to the US arms industry in World War II, and it's the reason why we have entire websites dedicated to what every single company that existed in the 1940s was doing to help the war effort. If you haven't checked out this website, by the way, you should. It's really, really cool. Now, generally, by 1940, it was written that should such needs for military equipment pop up, that mass tank production be given to locomotive manufacturers. Quite similar to what the British end up doing, actually, as they would already be experienced with working with large steel assemblies and castings. In fact, the engine bed of the average steam locomotive weighed 20 tons and could span more than 50 feet. Yeah, a tank is child's play compared to that. But there was one major problem. The Army had put in an order with Rock Island Arsenal for 126 tanks, but they knew they were going to need more, with word through the grapevine of an order of 1,600 tanks coming up. Contracts were awarded to Baldwin Locomotive and American Locomotive for M2A1 production in June of 1940, but the estimates were still too low and slow. It was looking like the locomotive industry wasn't going to be enough. They were going to need something completely new. They needed a tank production facility in the United States, the likes of which had never been seen before. The year is 1900, and a 21-year-old Danish man by the name of William S. Knudsen has just moved to the United States. Knudsen, Knudsen, I don't know. I'm gonna say Knudsen because for me it rolls off the tongue. A bicycle mechanic back home, he ends up working in a shipyard, then a railroad shop, eventually ending up at the John Keane Mills of Buffalo, New York. Here he got back to his trade of bicycle making, as well as fabricating other components for miscellaneous manufacturers, one of which being Ford. Knudsen rises to the superintendent of the Keene plant responsible for manufacturing Model T mufflers, axle housings, and fuel tanks. In 1911, the plant is bought out by Ford, with Knudsen himself becoming integrated into the company. His new role was to establish 14 new Ford plants across the country, as well as some in Europe. For this, he turned to one of the foremost leading experts in factory design in the entire world, Albert Kahn. Which, if you don't know this guy's name, you seriously should, because even before researching this video, I knew that he was possibly one of the most important industrial men of the first half of the 20th century. The dynamic duo would usher in a new era of factory construction, with their secret formula being to prioritize the establishment of workflows for the production lines, and then building the factories to suit them, as opposed to building the plant first, then having everyone just make the best of it. I haven't looked too far into it, but I'm sure if you are a car history nut, or just generally autistic about the establishment of the famous and iconic American automobile industry in Detroit and beyond, Knudsen and Kahn are probably familiar names. In April of 1921, Knudsen would jump from Ford to General Motors, where he rose the ranks, becoming vice president of GM in 1924 and the president of the whole shebang in 1937. Only 3 years later, however, in 1940, Knudsen would resign following an offer from President Roosevelt himself.
Roosevelt had approached Knudsen in May of 1940 with an offer. Seeing that General Motors had become the largest automobile manufacturer in the country, if not the whole world, President Roosevelt saw it fit to ask Knudsen if he would be willing to serve on the National Defense Advisory Commission, specifically as the Commissioner of Industrial Production, and he could not have picked a better candidate. His chief duties would be the acquisition of production facilities for the Army, facilities that would produce trucks, guns, planes, and indeed, tanks. In fact, upon accepting Roosevelt's offer, one of the first things he turned his attention to was the War Department's current issue of tank production. While he agreed with the department's overall decision to go with railroad manufacturers for their institutional knowledge, he knew that the railroad industry did not have the capacity to manufacture on the sheer scale the US was going to need. In short, they had the proper tools and know-how, but they didn't know mass production. Knudsen knew mass production, and he knew who else did too: the automobile industry. On Friday, June 7, 1940, William Knudsen gave a call to a Mr. K.T. Keller, then president of the Chrysler Corporation, and asked him if he'd be willing to build tanks for the government.
One of the first things he does, he makes a call to in the summer of 1940 to his pal K.T. Keller at Chrysler, president of Chrysler. He says, "K.T., can you make tanks?" And KT said, "Well, I don't know what a tank looks like, but show me one and I'll tell you whether I can make it or not."
A delegation from Chrysler met with a General Charles Wesson, then Chief of Ordnance, to discuss plans. Now, General Wesson was of the opinion that the automobile industry was not suited to build tanks. In fact, it's only a month later that he'll end up giving out the first contracts for M2A1 production to Baldwin Locomotive and American Locomotive. But he gave them a chance and outlined what the Army was going to need from Chrysler. They were told the Army desired 1,600 tanks weighing 20 tons. They're talking about the M2A1 there. But that need would likely increase to 5,000 tanks weighing 25 tons. A significant jump. Also, it's important to note that at this time, the M3 is starting to be designed. They know they want something new, but the name M3 hasn't quite been decided on yet, although it's about to be, and the design isn't finalized yet, although it's getting there. But at current rate, it would take them 750 days just to build 1,600 tanks. A pretty far cry from mass production. Chrysler was able to tour Rock Island Arsenal to see the current status of M2A1 production. They received design notes, specifications, and blueprints in order to estimate the cost of getting involved in this whole tank business. On the 26th of July, Chrysler and the Army once again met, with Chrysler bringing both good and bad news. The good news is that Chrysler had estimated the cost of building the M2A1 and figured they could bring together the men and machinery to do it, and were ready to sign a contract to get going. The bad news, however, was that, once again, no facilities to hold such an endeavor yet existed. Both the Ordnance Generals and the Chrysler delegation knew what this order demanded: a brand new tank production facility. The one the likes of which had never been seen before. Keller suggested they bring in Albert Kahn, who he had worked with prior on building the Dodge truck plant in 1938, which was a facility capable of spewing out 5,000 trucks per week. The Army and Knudsen, also familiar with Albert Kahn's work, wholeheartedly agreed. The contract was officially signed on August 15, 1940. Chrysler would oversee the construction of the Detroit Tank Arsenal and be contracted to produce 1,000 M2A1 medium tanks. Just after the land and equipment was purchased, however, the Army changed their mind. Ditch the M2A1. We want you to build the M3. Blueprints, drawings, and specifications coming shortly, of course. Remember what I had said earlier about the T5? But all of this work on the Phase 3 was side quest stuff. Yeah, well, we better go back and do those side quests now, because it's important. As we know, in the 1920s and 30s, the United States had been caught in what has been lovingly dubbed the cult of the machine gun, in which United States doctrine predominantly held that the best use for a tank was in support of infantry, and the best weapon seen at the time for supporting infantry was a machine gun. Ergo, all tanks are riddled with machine guns, the M2 being the epitome of this. I mean, the damn thing even has deflector shields on the back of the tank to ricochet bullets. Backwards firing machine guns ricochet their bullets downwards into trenches as the tank passed over. Seriously, that's not a joke. That is actually what those were for. However, in April of 1939, a formal test was done to see if this was actually the case. And so, a T5 Phase 3 vehicle was modified with a 75mm howitzer poking out the front and a new turret featuring .30 caliber machine guns and rangefinders. This tank was designated the T5E2. There was also an M2 equipped with an E2 flamethrower, but the tank had numerous problems. The gun was way too long and caused issues when operating in woodlands. The nitrogen canisters that were responsible for feeding the flamethrower were left out on the engine deck of the tank exposed to the open air, and during tests the tank experienced multiple mechanical problems. But anyway, T5E2 was tested and the results spoke for themselves. A 75mm howitzer was superior to machine guns for anti-infantry work. Who knew? The Army kept this knowledge in their back pocket, and although this would ultimately culminate in the desire to fit a 75mm gun into a turret of some kind, the events of the world in 1940 would demand that an intermediate solution be found. It was time to move to an M3 tank. Surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly given the situation, there never really was any kind of prototype M3, or even some kind of half-built concept vehicle. The M2 was the T5, and after that comes the T6, which is the M4. The M3 was so close in design to the M2 that it was accepted into service as soon as someone had put together a technical drawing of it. On July 11th, 1940, the medium tank M3 was officially standardized. It was Rock Island Arsenal who would build the first ever wooden mock-ups of an M3 in the summer, probably August, of 1940. The tank was built on the same chassis as the previous T5E2, including the hull-mounted 75mm gun. In fact, originally only this gun was desired, as well as plenty of machine guns, but the infantry board demanded that a 37mm gun of some kind be retained for anti-tank work, and the only place to put it was on a turret on the roof. In addition to the trickle production of M2A1 tanks, Rock Island Arsenal will continue to be the home of development for the M3. Now, all of this factory negotiating and tank designing was happening just in the nick of time for a particular group of people. You may have heard of them. They were going through a bit of a rough patch in the summer of 1940, and were looking for somewhere to mass-produce tanks. That's right, it's the British. The evacuation of Dunkirk had forced the British to leave behind a massive amount of weapons and equipment in exchange for saving the lives of some 300,000 soldiers. Now they needed to recoup on those losses. But the British knew that their domestic railroad industry wasn't going to be up to the task. In fact, in preparation for all of this, the British had previously dumped money into the US railroad industry for the express purpose of tooling up for tank production back in November of 1939. In total, they would end up spending $16.5 million improving the manufacturing capabilities of US railroad factories. Thanks, Britain. Now they were here to cash in on those investments. In July of 1940, the British sent a delegation to negotiate the manufacturing of British tanks in the United States, taking an interest in companies such as the American Locomotive Company. The US government, however, fought back. They were not entirely sure that the US industry could support the wholesale manufacture of both British and American tank designs. And in the event of a British surrender, they didn't want to be sacked with the mass production of someone else's tanks. Also, they just generally believed that the British designs were inferior. This British delegation, however, upon seeing the current status of M2A1 production and plans for the M3, felt that maybe they were the ones about to be sacked with the inferior tank designs. But ultimately, they didn't own the factories, and they had to take what they could get. At least they were allowed to make special requests, and even got a list of manufacturers that they could choose from. The British would sign their first contract for M3 tank production on September 18, 1940 for 500 tanks from the Pullman Standard Car Company. In addition, they'll also sign contracts with Baldwin Locomotive and the Pressed Steel Car Company. As for special requests, the British would quickly spot a major flaw in the design of the M3, the location of the radio down in the hull to be operated by an entire crew member. Now, in American doctrine, this is just how it was. The radio is in the bow of the tank and is operated by the hull machine gunner, or in this case, just a dude in the hull. The British, however, did not do things this way, as their radios were typically housed up in the turret to be used by the commander, which, as we know now, is the right way to do it. A British engineer by the name of Leslie Edward Carr would design a new turret that was big enough to fit the British radio, thus removing the need for the extra crewmen. They would also put a lower profile cupola on the tanks to allow them to be within spec to travel in British railways. Fun fact: as I mentioned, the M3 was considered incredibly close to the M2 in design, and as proof, the first ever casting of this British-style turret was fitted to an M2 hull at Rock Island Arsenal. Also, quite weirdly, the original castings of this British-style turret actually had a square loader's hatch mounted to the roof of the turret. But in the final production variants of the turret, it's removed. I'm not entirely sure who decided on that because it seems like a pretty good idea, and a loader's hatch is obviously something that American tanks will notably lack until about 1943, and something that the British will botch onto their Sherman Fireflies later on. In fact, even when the British-style turrets were first put into production, the hole for the square loader's hatch was not being cut into the casting, but the brackets for mounting the hatch were still there. And then even later, they eventually disappear as well. So there was provision, it was in the pipeline to put loader's hatches on these British turrets. For whatever reason, it just never ended up happening. This variant would end up being dubbed by the British as the Grant tank, with the American original recipe being dubbed the Lee. The idea was that the British designed tanks would be specifically for Lend-Lease use with the British, and the American tanks would be for the Americans. The British get the British one, the Americans get the American one. As I'm sure you can tell via foreshadowing, these plans end up changing. With production contracts finally starting to be signed, back at Rock Island Arsenal, the workshop kicked up their efforts in finishing the wooden mock-ups, as well as putting together tools in the line for the production of the first pilot M3 tanks. The Detroit Tank Arsenal began construction on September 9, 1940. Now, from the very beginning, the plan was to have a factory that was completely self-sustaining, not some kind of automobile factory that could manufacture 60% of the parts themselves and then rely on subcontractors. No. They wanted one factory that could cast its own hulls and turrets, fabricate its own gears and pistons, make its own fuel lines and suspensions, fire control systems, seats, optics, fuel tanks, fire extinguisher systems, cannons, and cupolas. A true one-stop shop where the entire tank would be built in-house. Spoiler alert, they never really get there. In fact, as the war goes on, the Detroit Tank Arsenal becomes less and less of a manufacturing facility and more of just an assembly plant, where all the parts are manufactured outside and then funneled in, and the Detroit Tank Arsenal is just where it's all put together into an assembled tank. But this was truly America's first real tank factory. Rock Island Arsenal was responsible for a lot of other things, and all the other manufacturers that get involved in M3 and eventually M4 production, Pullman Standard, Baldwin, all these guys, they're all other companies that do other things and just have to make tanks. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, from day one, was built from the ground up to be a facility that does one thing: build tanks. And America just had never had something like that before. To add on, the scale of this facility was immense. To build it used 6,500 tons of steel, 170,000 nuts, and 90,000 rivets. 51,000 tons of concrete, 200 miles of wire, 7,000 lights, and 80,000 glass panes covering 6.5 acres of the outside of the building, inside of which ran 12 miles of piping to distribute steam, water, and compressed air throughout the building. By January 28, 1941, 1/3 of the building had been completed, and a steam locomotive was rolled inside to provide heat while they got the main power plant up and running. On the 10th of February, tank parts started showing up at the factory, which now spanned a whopping 700,000 square feet. On the 17th, the steam locomotive was rolled out and local main power was switched online. And on April 12, 1941, the first Chrysler-built M3 pilot tank was constructed at the Detroit Tank Arsenal. But when 1941 first came around, the M3 tank, while being altogether on paper and promised to the British, was still not quite ready yet. Rock Island Arsenal is still scrambling to put together the first pilot model, and in February states they have the tank almost completed, but they were still waiting on certain components like the 75mm gun mount, the clutch throwout bracket, miscellaneous control components, and the installation of a transmission. They estimate the tank will be ready by about March, and they just about get there, along with everyone else. You see, by January of 1941, blueprints and design specs for the M3 had finally made it to the other manufacturers, like Baldwin, Pressed Steel Car, Chrysler, and American Locomotive, and they had finally gotten to work on a pilot model just like Rock Island Arsenal. And just like the 3 Ford GTs all lining up to cross the finish line together at Le Mans, March of 1941 sees everyone unveiling their first made M3 pilot tanks at just about the same time. An important clarification to make: there's a small discrepancy when the first M3 tanks actually came off the lines. If you want to go by the pilot models, meaning the first completed M3 tank that anyone ever actually built, then like I just said, pretty much everyone gets theirs done in just about March/April. However, most of the charts you'll find on M3 production and numbers don't start the clock until June/July. That's because that's when finally mainline serial production of M3 tanks begins. No longer pilot models, these are completed, ready tanks that are gonna go to the Army, and they're starting to really crank them out. Pick your poison, but in this next segment, when I refer to production stats, I'm gonna go by what all the charts say and exclude the pilot tanks.
Now, before I get too carried away, it's perhaps best that I start this chapter off with a quick introduction of all the actual factories that will be involved in producing the M3 medium tank for the next year and a half, starting with Rock Island Arsenal. As already discussed, this was the government-owned workshop of medium scale that was the initial home of development for the M2 and M3 medium tanks. The facility did have the means for small-scale trickle-line production, but as outside contractors were brought in to fill gaps, the role of Rock Island Arsenal in production shrank massively, where it once again returned to being a development and test bureau, and generally oversaw how things were going with tank production. Rock Island Arsenal actually never built any serial production M3 tanks, only pilot vehicles for the M3, M3A1, M3A2, and M3A3. Baldwin Locomotive Works. Baldwin was the first company to be contacted with the proposition of building tanks for the war effort. Their first contract was signed in October of 1940, but as mentioned previously, they were in talks with the Army as early as July. Baldwin will be the only factory to produce both American Lee and British Grant tanks. And as far as M3 production goes, Baldwin will end up having the longest run in the game, and earn second place in number of tanks built, only beaten by Chrysler themselves. They will remain as part of the medium tank production program all the way into the M4 Sherman. The American Locomotive Company. Initially, the American Locomotive Company, or ALCO for short, was approached by the British to build Mark VI cruiser tanks, but as I've covered, the United States government objected to British tank designs being made in America. Then in July of 1940, ALCO sat right alongside Baldwin Locomotive when US Army Ordnance went looking for companies to build tanks. Although Baldwin will technically be awarded the contract first, ALCO was really not far behind, being issued at the same time as Baldwin and signed a month later in November of 1940. They are right behind Baldwin as far as production numbers and will be the sole manufacturer of cast hull M3A1 Lee tanks. Just like Baldwin, ALCO will continue to produce tanks into the M4. Pressed Steel Car Company. Now, when you hear the name Pressed Steel Car, you might think this was an automobile manufacturer, but in fact, the car in their name specifically refers to carriage cars as found on trains. Indeed, this was their specialty before World War II. When the British Purchasing Commission was given its options of companies to build their Grant tanks, they chose Baldwin Locomotive, Pullman Standard, and Pressed Steel Car. As such, Pressed Steel solely manufactured M3 Grants and no other variant. Across 2 contracts, PSC will build a total of 500 M3 tanks and will remain to see production of the M4. Pullman Standard. Also a train car manufacturer, by 1940, Pullman Standard was one of the largest companies that had anything to do with passenger trains at all in the United States. They had their manufacturing side, Pullman Standard Car Company, and another half which was in charge of running sleeper cars, which was at the time a booming business in the passenger rail industry. The company had purchased an immense chunk of its competition, held stakes in pretty much every corner of its own industry, and even had its own company town in Illinois. Truly, it was a monopoly of all monopolies. In fact, so much so that the US government intervened in 1940 to demand that Pullman Standard divide up its monopoly, with the case finally settling in 1944. In the meantime, the manufacturing side of Pullman was awarded a contract for M3 Grant production for the British. Despite many setbacks and generally being slower than most of the other factories, Pullman Standard will produce 500 M3s between July of 1941 and July of 1942. Pullman Standard will soldier on and be awarded additional contracts for the M4. Chrysler. Chrysler was indeed the big man on campus. As I talked about at length already, the Chrysler Corporation was at the center of the US Army's desire to build a proper ground-up tank factory. Indeed, the facility lived up to its hype. Over the course of 4 contracts, Chrysler will produce 3,352 M3 and M3A4 medium tanks for the US between July of 1941 and August of 1942, where, quite famously, the Detroit tank arsenal will foster a literally seamless transition from the M3 to the M4 Sherman, with the first M4s coming off the lines directly behind the last M3s. I probably don't need to say this, but Chrysler will continue on and become the largest single manufacturer of the M4 medium tank. To be honest, I was particularly fascinated with just how much fanfare there was behind the M3. I've really never seen anything quite like it. The tank was very much in the public eye. It was hailed as America's first great medium tank, the tank that we were going to supply the war effort with. There were huge gatherings of factory workers and civilians alike, massive technical demonstrations, and even a naval-style champagne christening. For each individual factory, the Pilot M3 tank to roll off the lines was a massive boost of morale, and cherished like something of a trophy piece.
The Detroit tank arsenal gets its first M3 out the door, as previously mentioned, on April 12, 1941. On the 24th of April, it is used in a massive technical demonstration to the public and Chrysler shareholders and the government. The tank smashes through trees, crashes through buildings, trudges through water, fires its machine guns, which must have been blanks because there are literally shots where it seems like it's firing into the crowd, but I guess this was a different time, safety was less of a concern, and it generally just makes a fancy show for the bigwigs. In fact, this Chrysler demonstration ceremony on April 24th, 1941 can still be found on YouTube to this day. You can go find footage of it. This first M3 tank was actually funded entirely by Chrysler dealers who all pooled together to pay for the tank, meaning that the tank was given to the government for free as a gift. And in fact, on April 24th, after this massive demonstration ceremony, Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal surprised the government with a second M3 tank that rolled off the lines that very day. This would be the Detroit Tank Arsenal, setting an early precedent for early deliveries of tanks. Chrysler will pretty much always be ahead of schedule when it comes to the manufacture of M3s, and even M4s if I'm not mistaken. After the demonstration ceremony, the government revised its contract with Chrysler, seeing as this first tank was paid for by Chrysler dealers and not actually a part of the contract, because the government wasn't paying for it, the government wasn't buying it, so now it's not technically part of the contract. So the numbers had to be revised, but it also gave the government a good chance to finally and officially revise the contract itself in writing. Up to this point, the contract that Chrysler had signed with the government was to produce the M2A1, but obviously they get asked to do the M3. But now they finally officially revised the contract to say, build the M3. And a new price is set of $37,779 per tank. After the ceremony, this first Detroit Tank Arsenal built tank was sent over to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, where throughout World War II it was used in a series of, well, Aberdeen Proving Grounds type stuff. They test a bunch of fancy things with the tank, including putting it out on a range and plinking it with gunfire. And also, interestingly, I found a photo of them testing a trailer that could be hauled behind the tank, either for fuel or ammunition. But anyway, it kind of did basically that stuff. After World War II, the government gifted the tank back to Chrysler as just a sort of return gift to say, thank you, we're done testing it, we've got Shermans now to blow up, we're gonna give this one back to you. Eventually, Chrysler dug the tank back out of storage to be used during the unveiling opening ceremony of a brand new tank arsenal in Newark, Delaware. This new tank arsenal was scheduled to begin production of M48s, and again, during its open ceremony, the M3 was brought out and used as a display piece, something of a mascot to unveil this new tank factory and to show how far Chrysler had come. For many years, the tank sat with the new Chrysler Arsenal in Newark, Delaware, as something of a gate guard, a trophy piece, a bit of a mascot for the facility, until some years later when the facility was eventually shut down. After the facility was shut down, the tank was put up on display at the Veteran of Foreign Wars Post in Newark, Delaware, where you can still see it to this day. That's right, I drove all the way up to Delaware to film for this video, and yes, I am literally standing right next to the first ever M3 Lee tank to be built by the Detroit Tank Arsenal. This is literally serial number 2 M3 Lee. I genuinely can't believe the fact that I'm standing next to this tank right now and that I actually get to use it for the video. This is a truly, truly humbling experience. I mean, this is genuinely, other than the Rock Island Arsenal pilot, this is the earliest M3 ever, period. This is the first pilot M3 tank that Detroit Tank Arsenal ever produced in April of 1941. When you go up on YouTube and look at the Detroit Tank Arsenal reveal ceremony with that M3 driving through buildings and driving through mud, that's this tank. That is this exact tank. Thank you to everyone who watches these videos and supports everything I do to allow me to just do cool shit like this. Seriously, this is incredible. So finally, the M3 is out in the world, and factories like the Detroit Tank Arsenal are about to start cranking them out. Final production figures put the M3 at just over 4,000 tanks, in fact, including all models, Lees and Grants, everything all together, including sub-variants and other models. I think it actually is closer to 5,000 just about. Nowhere near the Sherman, but hey, not bad. But as much as we'd like to think that tank production is all sunshine and rainbows, and despite how I've been kind of spending this video hyping up all of the prep work that the US Army Ordnance and all the arsenals and everything have been doing to make sure that mass production of tanks actually happens and goes off without a hitch, the United States is about to find out that becoming the arsenal of democracy is a little bit easier said than done. One of the most notable bottlenecks in production of the M3 was actually the 75mm hull-mounted cannon. In the beginning, the 75mm gun planned for the M3 was a low-velocity anti-aircraft gun that was going to have a few changes made to it to fit inside of a tank, thus designating it the 75mm gun M2. This is the standard short-barrel 75mm gun you'll find on most M3 tanks, with this gawky counterbalance mounted to the front, which indicates that the tank was fitted with a stabilizer. As development of the M3 medium tank continued, and eventually planning for the T6, what will become the M4, starts, it's noticed on the T6 that they can get away with a longer barrel without having the gun extend over the front of the hull. They can do away with that gawky counterbalance and get a little bit of extra muzzle velocity out of the gun. They also rotate the recoil mechanism 90 degrees and make a few other changes to allow the gun to fit into what will be the Sherman's turret. These modifications are made, and this new 75mm gun is designated the M3, rather confusingly, and is immediately requested to be fitted to the M3, the Lee, with the previous M2 gun being denoted as substitute standard. But as you might guess, changing what gun is going to be in your tank while you are spooling up production for said tank is going to cause some issues. Initially, only 2 companies are making the 75mm gun M3. This is soon increased to 3 as soon as the desire to fit the M3 gun into the Lee is brought up, but it's still lagging far behind. By the end of 1941, 1,216 75mm guns are built, of all types. But production of American Lee tanks is at 1,342, not even counting the British orders. As a result of this, many photos of M3 tanks during production show them without their 75mm guns. In fact, many of their tanks had their guns stolen from them after they had gone through QA to then be put on other tanks so that they could then be brought through QA. Sound familiar? In general, only very late production M3 medium tanks end up with the M3 gun. Most Lee Grants that were produced still have the M2 75mm gun, not to be confused with the M2 medium tank. Oh boy. Proper mass production of the M3 75mm gun won't be there until May of 1942, when they were finally building more guns than tanks. But by that point, the Lee Grant will only be in production for another 2 months. Oh well. The gun was more so meant for the Sherman anyways. Now, the 37mm guns experienced similar setbacks. Constant changes and improvements to the guns were made over and over and over again, but it's the M5 and M6 guns that end up in the Lee. And the story is just about the same. Orders are made for the M5, then before production has even properly gotten started, it's changed to the M6. Quickly, it's realized that additional manufacturers are going to need to be brought in, including a company called the United Shoe Machinery Corp. In October of 1941. But they won't get their 37mm guns off the line until January of 1943, way after the M3 Lee had ceased production. I mean, what do you expect? They're a goddamn shoe company. Two other companies get involved in production, including one called the National Pneumatic Company, who had been the makers of pneumatic door openers like you'd see on buses. And now they're making 37mm cannons. That's pretty cool if you ask me. By late 1942, the gun problem is just about solved. But like I said, the M3 will only be in production until the end of the summer of 1942. So, for all intents and purposes, the gun problem will plague the M3 for its entire life. It's not necessarily that tanks were going into battle without guns, but rather you'd end up with this bottleneck in production where tanks are finished coming off the lines with all of their features except their guns, and they have to be put aside in a motor pool or something somewhere, and they can't be shipped out until they get their guns, and the company has to wait. And it's frustrating, and it slows down delivery. Now, not just the guns, but the transmissions and engines were also bottlenecks in M3 production. The latter of these issues was solved by the multitude of engines that were produced for the M3, most of which will end up carrying over into the M4. As for the transmissions, the original contractor, Mack, was falling behind on tooling up for production, specifically due to a shortage of vertical boring mills. And they had to make do with handcrafting their first two transmissions, and just handing them out to manufacturers where they just got passed around for everyone to make use of on their first pilot M3s. One of these two transmissions was shipped to American Locomotive Company, where it was used when they unveiled their first ever pilot M3. And then after the demonstration, it was stripped of that transmission. The transmission was then sent to Baldwin locomotives so that they could put it onto their pilot M3 and then show it off. Again, stripping parts off of tanks that had successfully been completed so they could take new tanks and complete them. Now, for these pilot tanks, it's not so much of a big deal because, again, it's a pilot tank. The whole idea is to just show, hey, we can make this. They assemble it, complete it, they drive it in circles, they confirm that it works, everything they've built is to spec, they know how to make M3s that function, and then take that transmission and give it to someone else so that they can use it to see if their pilot M3 tank functions. But for mainline serialized production, fallbacks like this are gonna become very, very important. As with the guns, more contractors were brought in for manufacturing of transmissions, such as the Iowa Transmission Company, which will become quite an important company for this specific task, as well as another company called Spicer. In 1941, a committee was brought together to emphasize the distribution of common parts to manufacturers. So if, for example, one factory was really good at making bearings and they just had a bunch of them lying around, and another factory was falling behind on its bearing production and wasn't keeping up, the company that had a lot of extra bearings lying around could distribute those bearings to all the people who really needed some, and therefore level the playing field, allowing every manufacturer was up to speed and had everything they needed. Free interchange of components could be made between British contractors and US contractors, exemplified in the supply of armor plates and 37mm guns by us to the US, and the supply of transmissions and 75mm guns from the US to our contractors. This interchangeability ultimately gave way to a pooling of all free issues, an allocation of such components that were in short supply by the US ordnance to the contractors so as to maintain maximum possible overall production. And finally, the bottleneck in production of engines. And I think maybe we should take a seat for this one because it's quite a long story. Initially, the engine that was planned to be used in the M3 was the previously mentioned R975 Whirlwind radial engine. Now, the use of aircraft engines in tanks was not a new concept. In fact, by this point in history, it was actually quite common. Aircraft and tanks have similar characteristics that they need out of their engines, specifically as much horsepower as you can get out of as little weight as possible. Plus, the R975 was already quite a popular engine in the United States for actual aircraft, so the US already knew they were going to be pumping them out in substantial numbers. What's a few thousand more? As it would turn out, a few thousand more makes all the difference. The original manufacturers of the R975, the Wright Aeronautical Company, instantly knew they were not going to be able to keep up with the demand for this engine for both airplanes and tanks, especially when they found out that it was going to be more than just the M3 and M2 medium tanks that were going to be using this engine. Quickly, a licensing deal to produce the engine was struck with Continental Motors, who managed to crank out so many of the things that I legit originally thought they were the original manufacturers of the engine. Seriously, I've always called it the Continental R975, but no, the engine was invented by Wright. And it would continue to be Wright who would further develop the engine and work out all of its kinks all the way past 1942. Even still, especially as the scale of US tank production scaled up rapidly between 1940 and 1941, the US Army still knew that they were not going to have enough engines, even with Continental involved. Their predictions came to fruition when, along with guns and transmissions, M3 tanks were rolling off the production lines only to be thrown into motor pools awaiting an engine. As the problem dragged out for months and became more and more serious, a call was finally made to outside, large-scale manufacturers for a solution. General Motors had been working on a series of diesel engines since about 1937, when during the development of the M2 medium tank, the Army suddenly had a newfound interest in diesel engines, as I mentioned earlier in the video. Now, other than the far lesser tendency of diesel fuel to catch fire due to it having a higher flash point, diesel engines also have an increased fuel economy and better torque at lower RPMs when compared to gas engines, making them oddly perfect for use in tanks. And indeed, the interest in diesel engines was growing in the United States up until about 1942, when it was finally declared that we were actually just going to standardize on gas engines. Now, going forward, no questions asked. However, unlike in Germany, the diesel engine would soldier on in the United States in the form of many other projects, like what General Motors was doing here. Most notably, the GM 671 six-cylinder two-stroke diesel engine, which was developed by General Motors but kept alive by British interests. They liked the engine and wanted it to be used in Canadian-built Valentine tanks. So, when the United States came knocking, asking for a brand new power plant for a potential medium tank, General Motors just took two 671 engines, turned them around, and slapped them together into what we now know as the Twin 6046. In August of 1941, the US Army approved the installation of a Twin 6046 diesel engine into an M3 medium for testing. By the end of November, the tests were completed and glowing. So much so that immediately after, it was recommended to Baldwin Locomotive that they stop all production of gas-powered tanks and switch entirely, at Baldwin Locomotive specifically, all M3 Lees and Grants going forward be diesel-powered. Only days later, the twin diesel was recommended for adoption as a substitute standard for the R975, and the new nomenclature M3A3 be developed and applied to tanks using this diesel engine. Now, to be fair, although I'm making it sound like this engine was adopted so fast because it was just so good, in reality, it's more likely that the process was simply expedited due to the increased demand. The United States needs an alternative engine for the M3 right now, and this one seems to work. Plus it's diesel powered, so why not? As an example to just how badly a solution for this problem was needed, the United States actually ended up also testing another diesel engine in an M2A1 tank in September of 1941, the T1400 Gilbertson radial diesel engine. This engine was immediately recommended to replace the R975 before testing had even properly finished. One engine was installed in an M3 tank, 2 contracts for production were issued out to Gilbertson, and even an expansion of the Gilbertson production facilities were planned on America's dime to increase Gilbertson capacity to manufacture these engines. And then the tests came back.
When it comes to 8-month-old
T1400,
you are not
The engine was just unreliable. Later down the line, in 1942, a meeting was held to straighten out all the different engines that were currently in use in medium tank production. During this meeting, the desire for the Twin 6046 General Motors engine was doubled down on, specifically to fulfill Soviet and British requests. But it was also stated that no new radial engines were desired. Then, the expansion facilities originally planned for the Gilbertson factory were leased out to Continental, where they used it to produce the R975. Ouch. But during all of this hoopla to find a new tank engine, during their moment of weakness, the United States reached out to one other manufacturer. Chrysler recalled a meeting in July of 1941 where the problem of medium tank engines was brought up to them. Quote, A message was given to the effect that high authority in Washington had advised Chrysler management that capacity for producing the current tank engines is limited, and Chrysler's suggestions are urgently needed for producing tank engines in a hurry. Chrysler engineers set to work on a solution, but time was of the essence, and creative thinking was going to be needed. Quote, "A possible solution suggested is to use an automobile or truck engine in multiple, which has had a background of years of successful operation and which is completely tooled, produce a unit to have the desired power for tank propulsion. Such a unit is not to be considered an ultimate tank engine, but simply as a stopgap until more suitable engine design could be developed." They settled on the now famous and iconic Chrysler Pentagram design, taking 5 individual 6-cylinder car engines, specifically the C34 engine from the Royal Sedan lineup of Chrysler vehicles, and slapping them all together on one crankcase. On August 22, 1941, K.T. Keller wrote to Knudsen, saying, quote, "Our boys have found a way to put 5 engines together so none has a tendency to gather oil. You will find that we have developed a very ingenious arrangement of firing so that when the 5 engines are mothered to one shaft, we get smooth firing order." The engine was first tested on November 13th, and on the 15th it was installed in an M3. Final approval for the A57 Chrysler multi-bank engine to be mounted in M3 tanks as an alternative to the R975 was officially signed the day after Christmas, 1941. Tanks using this engine were to be given the designation of M3A4. Most of these engines should sound familiar to any of you Sherman heads out there, but you might have noticed that we've left one out. The Ford GAA, the famous and iconic Ford GAA. Well, unfortunately, the Ford GAA was just not developed during this time. It was actually made specifically for the Sherman program when Ford gets involved. Ford is not involved in M3 production, and thus they never had a need to develop a tank engine yet. Meaning it's the only engine of the big 4 that did not see use in both the Lee and the Sherman. In summary, the engine problem reared its ugly head pretty early on, but was not properly addressed until quite a few months into M3 production. Identified in the summer of 1941 and not properly corrected until the fall. And even then, I wouldn't say the engine issue was completely solved until the turn of the year, into 1942. Out of all the factories that would end up being contracted to produce the M3 Lee, the M3 Grant, and indeed the M4 Sherman, the Baldwin Locomotive Company was probably one of the most unique. To start with, they were the first company ever approached to build the M3, but also they were the first company offered to the British, making Baldwin the only facility that will produce both M3 Lees and M3 Grants, as I've already discussed. They were also quite unique in the fashion in which they did business. On April 9th, 1942, an engineer by the name of C.F. Schneff wrote regarding the conditions of the Baldwin Locomotive Factory to the Tank Division of the War Office Production Board. For his report on Baldwin, he wrote the following.
Baldwin is an old, supremely self-satisfied, secretive outfit that regard myself and the government ordnance men here as outsiders to be tolerated with passive resistance, told nothing, and spoken to only when necessary. They are a devious crowd, and might, if I do get in there hard, which I am leaning backwards not to do, concoct some complaint concerning me in order to discredit me in Washington. If I followed my personal inclination, I would turn my back on this plant and keep going indefinitely. But I'm staying right here with them to see if we can keep them producing in spite of themselves. As an example of how they work, I'll cite an instance of today. They build the riveted hull British tank with a cast housing containing the rotor of the 75mm gun. The machining of this housing is done on planners, and their capacity is very limited. I have been urging them to recruit some milling machines in their rod shops to relieve these planners and boost the output. I made another appeal today, and then, under promise of secrecy, they said that they had acquired considerable additional outside capacity on planners that would solve their problem. But nobody must be told, and I wouldn't have been told except that I nailed them down and told them just how the mills could do the job despite their opinions otherwise. How is that for cooperation? Of course, I play dumb about their attitude and keep offering to help them in any way within our ability, and possibly we shall ultimately get under their skins. Their management, to my mind, is incapable, and while the plant is enormous and impressive, they are doing a poor job. I suspect that a major reason for this incompetence was not the fact that the factory was legitimately bad at the job, but rather it was because of the way Baldwin was brought into the tank business. Baldwin was unique from the other tank manufacturers in that their contract was awarded on what's called a cost-plus basis. Essentially, instead of a normal contract we would imagine where the company is paid for each tank that they produce at the end of a given contract time, Baldwin was paid one large sum immediately that was to cover all the costs for tooling up the line, the costs of building each tank, and the profit they would be projected to make from them. Meaning that the moment Baldwin got the contract, they had made their money. In fact, they would ultimately be paid $2,397,500 for this contract. So if they aren't paid by how many tanks they can build within a set amount of time, then what's the rush? This sentiment is echoed by Schneff in his reports. Quote, "They're on a cost-plus basis, so the more they spend, the merrier. Hence their impatience with a chap like myself, who might be tactless enough to point out inefficiencies in their operations, however politely, and besides might report things to Washington." Still, credit where credit is due, Baldwin did manage to complete all 535 US Lee tanks and all 685 Grant tanks in the order within the allotted time. Quote, "This outfit today again shipped 4 tanks, and they are staggering along, out of one component today and another tomorrow. Just their lack of skill in planning their requirements and then following up their plans. At this long last, they seem awakened to their deficiency and are taking steps in the right direction to remedy the trouble." As production for the M3 wound down, it was decided that tooling and jigs for production of M3 tank parts be saved, so that even once mainline production had ceased, parts could still be manufactured as needed for the tanks that had gone out. Initially, Chrysler was picked for this task, but seeing that Chrysler was busy with a lot of other things, the responsibility was ultimately passed down to Baldwin. But even outside of these larger scale examples, M3 production will experience multiple small hiccups along the way. Each factory brews its own concoction of complications unique to their way of doing things and their overall logistical situation. As the M3 design evolves and new features are added, or old ones taken away, this will also create unique bottlenecks in production that some factories handle better than others. These kinks are to be expected when you set up these large-scale production lines for the first time, and over the course of the year, they get ironed out. Mostly.
What I mean to highlight with this segment is that despite what we may think about the US tank industry in World War II, initially they had just as many problems as anyone else. When you're doing something like this for the very first time, and especially on this scale, you're just going to encounter issues. All the prep work can help, but nothing can truly prepare you for the real thing. In many ways, production of the M3 went far from smoothly. You have many instances where older tanks could not be completed and sent out off the factory lines because they were missing certain features, and they would be held back while they awaited those features to arrive. Again, things like guns, transmissions, engines, all the things we've discussed. But then some of the newer model tanks could be coming through the factory and they end up with parts and they roll off the lines. And then eventually, when those older tanks get the parts that they were waiting for, then they go out overseas. And you end up with this funny situation where you might actually receive a batch of older model tanks after you've received a batch of newer model tanks. In fact, logistical quirks like this one will even continue into the Sherman. But eventually, the machine would become so well-oiled that it would earn its legendary status as the arsenal of democracy. Given the efforts of US industry to standardize on components, distribute components evenly amongst all manufacturers to ensure everyone was on a level playing ground, remediate bottlenecks in production by issuing out new contracts and bringing in more and more people to produce components that were experiencing shortages, the state of the American tank industry by the end of the M3's production life and the beginning of the M4's became such that Colonel Christmas wrote to the Chief of Ordnance on March 5th, 1942, saying, quote, "Tank production in this country is now so well established and is planned for such large facilities and quantities of tanks that shortly the overall requirements of the United Nations can be furnished by the United States." And with that, I think I'm gonna have to cut this part short here. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I genuinely planned for this whole thing to be one 4-hour-long documentary. But once again, for digestibility and also to give the patrons a little something special, I decided to cut this up into 2 parts. As you can probably tell by the little red bar at the bottom, part 1 is now coming to an end. In this part, we looked at the state of tanks and tank manufacturing in the United States in the years prior to World War II, 1936 to 1940. We covered what happened when France fell and the ripple effect that was seen through the US military. We covered the rise of figures like William Knudsen and K.T. Keller to positions that would put them in power to make serious decisions regarding the establishment of the American tank industry. And we covered the construction of the Detroit tank arsenal, the contracts awarded out to all the different factories that will eventually be involved in M3 production. We covered the British getting involved and how they end up seeing the whole thing. And now we finished off with the M3 in manufacturing, all the initial issues encountered and bottlenecks in production, and just generally what it was like building one of these damn things. In part 2, we're going to cover just how many of these they actually ended up making, all the different variants, how to identify them, and all of the different sub-models and sub-variations. Armored recovery vehicles, mobile artillery, even some GMCs. So stick around and get ready for part 2 to see some of that epic stuff, including a very, very special guest. That's right, the next episode will be a somewhat bewildering guide to the M3 Lee. But of course, we won't stop there, as I'll also end up covering the combat debut of the M3, all the different nations that the M3 actually served with during World War II, and what everyone thought of them, before obviously giving final conclusions. So for the end of part 1, I just want to say thank you all so much for watching, and keep your eyes open for part 2. According to Corridor Digital, if you watch one of my videos and then go and watch another one of my videos, that second video of mine that you watch apparently is seen by the YouTube algorithm the same as subscribing. So if you're not quite sure that you want to subscribe, but you are thinking about it, just go watch another one of my videos, and what better second video to watch than part 2 of this series? That's right, this was part of my evil plan all along. Anyways, one last shout out to the patrons again for helping me actually make content like this and be here for this sort of thing, and I can't wait to see you in part 2. Thank you so much for watching.